Welcome to the Rewrite Your Life Story podcast, hosted by your favourite duo, Stephen and Charlene. They're here to help you transform your mindset and create a positive outlook on life. Are you tired of feeling stuck and unfulfilled? Are you ready to take control of your thoughts and emotions and rewrite your story? Well, you're in the right place. They will be sharing inspiring stories, practical tips, and expert advice to help you on your journey to a better you. You'll learn how to let go of negative self-talk, embrace your strengths, and focus on the good things in life. Each episode will be joined by amazing guests who have rewritten their own life stories and are now living their best lives. From successful entrepreneurs to accomplished athletes, we'll bring you stories of resilience, courage, and triumph. So grab a cup of coffee, get cozy, and get ready to be inspired. Tune in every week for a new episode of the Rewrite Your Life Story podcast. Let's rewrite our stories together and make every day count.
In this episode of Rewrite Your Life Story podcast, we hear about Margaret Rice. Margaret Rice is a seasoned journalist, author, and public speaker with a deep passion for increasing death literacy and fostering a greater understanding of grief. With a career spanning medical reportage and editorial notes, Margaret brings a wealth of knowledge and empathy to the subject of death and dying. Margaret's transformative journey began in 2012 when she took time off from her journalistic career to be with her dying mother, who resided in a nursing home. This experience revealed a significant gap in her understanding of death, which she recognized as a prevalent cultural problem. Determined to shed light on this topic, Margaret started taking notes at her mother's bedside, eventually leading to the publication of her book, A Good Death, a compassionate and practical guide to prepare for the end of life. So join us as we delve into her story.
Before we get started, we want to remind you that the information presented in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and their guests are their own and do not represent the views of any organisation or entity. Additionally, any information presented should not be taken as legal, medical, or financial advice. Always consult with a licensed professional in the respective field for any advice or guidance. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic and learn how to transform our lives through positive thinking and taking control of our stories. Thanks for joining us.
Before we begin, we want to give you a heads up. We may be discussing some sensitive and personal topics that might bring up some strong emotions or discomfort. Our goal is to create a safe and supportive space, but we know that everyone's experiences and triggers are different. If you start feeling overwhelmed or triggered during an episode, remember to prioritize your well-being. It's totally okay to hit pause and take a breath. Your self-care is important, and looking after your mental and emotional health should always come first. If you ever need extra support, we encourage you to reach out to a mental health professional or someone you trust. You're not alone, and there are resources available to help you on your personal journey. Thank you for joining us on this incredible ride with the Rewrite Your Life Story podcast. Together we'll navigate life's challenges and rewrite our narratives with strength and resilience.
Hey everyone, Stephen and Charlene here from Rewrite Your Story, and we're really excited to have Margaret Rice on today's show. Now, Margaret Rice has a very interesting story about her rewriting her story, and I'm actually really excited to have Margaret here because we've worked with Margaret a little while, and I know you've done a few facilitations, Charlene, with Margaret. And Margaret is an author of a book called The Good Death. So Margaret's going to tell us a little bit of how she started writing about death out of all subjects. But before we go into that, Margaret, do you want to just tell us a little bit about who you were before you became a death enthusiast?
I've always been a journalist. I love journalism. I love writing. I love newspapers, the news experience, and connecting with people. In the olden days when I first started, you'd spend a lot of time going out to interview people. We don't tend to do that as much these days because of the time pressures. But yeah, so I grew up in Strathfield, educated by the Dominicans at Santa Sabina, so I'm a Catholic girl. I'm a lapsed Catholic. I've got an uncomfortable relationship with the Catholic Church, and that's because of its management of the child abuse issue.
Yeah.
I've got some quite specific issues around some things that happened. I wasn't sexually abused myself, but being from where I was in my part of the world, I was exposed to people who were. So I have an awkward relationship with the Catholic Church, but that's my tribe and that's my origin. So, so that's, I went to Sydney University when I left school, and then straight from university, I landed a job at the Sydney Morning Herald as a cadet medical reporter.
Okay.
As a cadet reporter, not a medical reporter. I came to that later.
Oh, okay.
So has all your writing been around medical after that, or?
Look, not really. I've tended to specialise in medical writing, but I've written local news for local newspapers, and I have written other material, other articles. I've done a lot of news reporting over the years, but it's always the medical reporting and the medical writing that I've been attracted to and was drawn back to.
So, Margaret, as a journalist, obviously you've seen a lot and you've heard a lot, right? And you've interviewed a lot and definitely broadened your worldview. As a journalist. What took you on a pathway of actually writing about death? Like, it's so different, and then writing a book about death. Like, what was the turning point for you?
It was a very particular set of circumstances. So the story becomes a little bit personal, if you're happy for me to share that.
Yeah.
In 2011, my mother died in a nursing home in Strathfield, the other side of the suburb where she had lived all her married life, in fact, all her childhood as well. And I was a medical writer, had been for years, and I realised during the process of mum dying, and even before, when she was first diagnosed with lung cancer, that I knew nothing about death. And I was the person in the family, because I had been a medical writer, who tended to be the one who took mum and dad to medical appointments. And I was absolutely bowled over by how I knew nothing. And when the active process of dying started for mum, I took time out from work. I thought it was predicted it might take a week for her to die. It took 3 weeks. So it was like being, without being gruesome or melodramatic about it, as mum was dying, I felt as though I was being buried alive as well. Because I spent so much time with her, looking after her in that space, advocating for her, and being a link so that my siblings could be made aware when the time came for us to gather and vigil with mum. Mum had always said to me that she was frightened of dying. We always knew that. She had said to me when she was lucid that she wanted her children around her. And in order for me to be able to achieve that for her, I took time off work. And it was without being, again, overstating it, it was a road to Damascus experience. It absolutely changed my life, because I knew an awful lot about the medical system and the way it was supposed to work in Australia. And there were 3 or 4 parallel experiences that I was having that were very concentrated. One was the personal experience of having an intimate 3 weeks with my mother as she was dying, and reviewing my relationship with her and all the good and the bad of that. The second thing was watching, as a person who was taking notes, I had started writing, and mum had given me her consent, her blessing to writing about this death. The next part of the story is about somebody who has a sense, for example, that the role of morphine plays in modern medicine, and seeing no morphine being delivered to this woman who was dying from lung cancer Yes, it was offered very, very late in the piece in a very perfunctory way. There was also a coming together of awareness of the deficiencies in the way that we had set up or were set up culturally, because here was a woman who was dying a cancer death with a gap, serious gaps in the palliative care that she should have been given. And because of my understanding of what was available, I saw this terrible disconnect, and I realised that she was not receiving all the services that I had assumed one would, because she was an old person who was dying in a nursing home. And 12 years ago, or 11 years ago, when she was dying, there has been a bit of progress since. Not a huge amount, but enough. But back then, if somebody was dying and they were having a painful death that was poorly served in those circumstances, nobody batted an eyelid, because this is an old person. She's meant to die. She's dying, and it's happening. So where were the supports for her, and where were the systemic supports? So I'll give you an example of the sorts of things that would happen. She was supposed to have fly-in palliative care, but if we rang for that, it would take probably an hour and a half for somebody to arrive to review or discuss her morphine. Now, if you've ever known somebody who's dying who desperately needs the next hit of pain relief, to know that they're going to have to wait an hour and a half for somebody even to walk in the door is terrible. The other thing which was typical was on a Friday she had breakthrough pain, and I went to the matron and said, we've got to do something about this. And she said, we have to go through the general practitioner if we want to change or upgrade her morphine or review it. And I said, well, let's get on to the general practitioner. And she said, oh, look, I'm sorry, it's her day off. It's Friday. Oh. We'll have to wait till Monday for your GP to see your mother. And I said, well, yeah, but she's got this flying squad that's supposed to be coming in from the local teaching hospital, so we can just sidestep that. And the matron explained that the protocol was such that that could not be sidestepped. So here was a woman who was in terrible pain. By any measure, a lung cancer death is considered to be a style of death that needs a very high level of palliative care. But because she was in a nursing home, that wasn't happening because it was a Friday and her GP was having a day off. This case was not going to be reviewed. So I just said to the matron, oh, look, I'm going to go and have a cup of coffee. I'll slip out for 5 minutes. And I was spending every day there and did. And then I slipped out, got on my mobile phone and rang the local fly-in group and said, look, we really need you. And they said the same thing. They said, oh, look, there's a protocol. And I said, there might be a protocol, but there's a woman here who's in a lot of pain and her GP is off until Monday. The woman paused and she said, oh, look, I'll see what I can do. And then when I went back to the nursing home, the matron said, look, you wouldn't believe it. We've just had a call from the flying unit. And this is just one illustration of so many things that happened during that death where I thought it's got to be better. And because I was a medical reporter, I knew the technicalities about how it could be better. Yeah. But we were culturally asleep, saying, well, she's just an old lady. Yeah. That basically was the attitude towards it. So during that process too, I thought, I'm going to go down to the local library to see if I can find a book that covers what I want to know. And nothing. If I'd asked for a book about birth, there would have been 1,000 in that library. But if I asked for a book about death, there was nothing. So I went to a couple of other libraries and had the same experience. And then I just thought, well, I've started taking notes. Mum knows that I'm taking these notes. I'm going to write the book. I'm going to write the book that I can't find. But during that very slow death, at one point, Mum said to me, she just put her hands up and she said, why? Now, I don't really know what that why was about. She had been somebody who'd suffered dementia and then went into this lucidity the closer she got to death. But when she said why, I just took that as why. Like, you could say why anything. Why am I dying in this place? Why is it happening like this?
Yeah.
So I just said, Mum, I don't know why, but I will do everything I can to find out, to answer your question, your open-ended why. And that's what led me to the journey I'm on now. So when I went back to work after Mum died, I resigned to write this book. And then I did that I can't remember whether it was the Wednesday or the Thursday. And then on the following Saturday, like 2-3 days later, after I'd given in my resignation, but was still serving out my time, my 6 weeks notice, on the Saturday, my brother was killed in a motorcycle accident. So I now found myself, having officially resigned to write about death, now experiencing a very different one. So those things change you. And writing was therapeutic. It was meant to be a consolation after Mum died. It became almost a mocking kind of death was throwing down the gauntlet. Okay, all right, you said you want to write about appropriate death in old age. Here's a sucker punch, your brother. And I thought I could be really superstitious about this and back away from the project, say it's too much, I can't do it. Or I can just look death in the eye and say, I'm not going to be intimidated. I'm going to find out more, and every single thing I find out, I am going to share. And that's the mission. It became a mission. It's a vocation.
Yeah, you really did rewrite your story with that grief,
Yeah.
Completely.
You know, so many things are going through my mind when you said that. Many of the listeners won't know this, but my background is in nursing, and I was a palliative care nurse. And my hair, well, I got goosebumps when you said they weren't administering morphine. I'm like, how could they do that to someone at that stage of this disease? And for me, it's so important. And Margaret, we've had this discussion many times that people choose to die the way they want to die. And I have looked after many of my family members in their home and stayed there like the last week's 24 hours and have administered morphine and done that up until recently. This year in February, you know, one of my dear aunties lost her battle to cancer, and it was a very sudden, a 3-day death. It was just very quick. And that's why I didn't actually facilitate the Death Cafe 2 weeks later.
Right. Okay.
It was just too raw for me.
Too close.
To facilitate that, be a facilitator in that Death Cafe. So to have seen that is quite traumatic.
Yeah. Towards the very end, in the last couple of days, they did draw up some morphine for her. But there was a moment when, you know, I said to one of the nursing staff, please give her her dose. She's in such pain. And the nurse said to me that Mum would have to wait. She was the only registered nurse on. She was doing the meds for everybody. Mum just had to wait her turn.
Which goes to what a lack we have in our aged care systems in Australia.
Yeah, since then, of course, we've had the Royal Commission, which has shone a spotlight on this. I think there's an element of ageism in all of this. And I think that ageism was more pronounced 11 years ago. I'm very pleased to say that when my father died 2 years ago, it was a very different experience. I was able to be there as an advocate for him. He wasn't dying a lung cancer death, so he wasn't in that excruciating pain. But when there was a moment, and it wasn't protracted, when there was a moment when it appeared that he could be suffering or could be in some pain, I turned to the staff and said, look, what can we do? And there couldn't have been a greater contrast. It was actually the same institution because Dad insisted on going back there. Dad did not agree with me. He did not see anything. He did not want to know that there was anything irregular in the way that Mum was managed. He wanted to believe that it was fine. And there was a very much a stiff upper lip, this is the way, you don't make a fuss, that was going on. But anyway, when he died, and I was able to turn to them at one point only a day or two before he died and said, look, I think he might have a need here for a bit of morphine. They said, yeah, sure. Wow. What do you think? So I had been advocating for Dad. I learnt from what was not around and not available with Mum, and applied that to Dad. And again, another set of learnings that brought me to where I am now.
Yeah.
Margaret, can I ask the question? And your mother and your brother passed away quite near each other in a short period.
8 weeks, yeah. Yeah.
But one was one that you knew this was imminent.
Yep.
One was just a sudden. How did the two work? Would you say the grief was the same, or was the grief different?
No. The grief was completely different for each one.
Yeah.
And it was with Mum, she had been gradually developing dementia over the previous 2 or 3 years, and she had been losing capacity. And for me, there was a lot of what we call anticipatory grief. There was a lot of that grief you feel before the person dies. I was going through a grieving process over Mum's death, and it was just starting to lift when Julian died. And then that was a completely different experience of grief. It was a sense of overwhelming loss. Julian was my very dear friend. We had a lot in common. We were from a strong, connected, big family. His loss devastated me, and I felt it very, very differently. There was a sense of the physical rifting, the physical tearing, the physical trauma of loss. And that was partly because he was so young and partly because it was so sudden. And there were lots of things about that death that were awkward and hard. He was killed in a motorcycle accident, and the young driver never accepted responsibility for causing the accident. Yeah. And that had consequences that played out over the next year and a half, because she fought the case before the magistrate, and that was very traumatic for the family. So it was a very hard one, and I found myself becoming increasingly depressed as time passed. There was something else that was happening, though. I'd started to write the book about Mum and Mum's death and that experience, and I was pushing Julian aside. And then there was a particular moment where 9 months into the process, I was really exploring some of the issues around the way that Mum's pain was managed. And it was definitively said to me by a palliative care nurse who didn't know that I was talking about the experience of my own mother, because I was deliberate about not telling her. But I gave her this case study about the way that a death that I knew of had been handled. And she said, no, it doesn't happen like that. And I said, oh, look, I do know a case where it did. And she said, well, it shouldn't. So then there was this moment where suddenly a whole lot of research that I'd been doing around the subject of death all fell into a position. And I also felt as though I'd put together a missing piece about Mum. Something clicked into place about various aspects of the story through the course of that interview. And I had set out to do 100 interviews. You know, I wanted to say to the reader, this is the story of our community. And I wanted to be able to think that anybody can go to sources within their community and understand and find out more about death. And so that's what I was planning to do. But when I came to this particular moment where these two things came together, Mum's this insight into mum's pain confirmed, and then a magistrate's case that went very badly in relation to Julian's death, I just then went from being depressed but still writing to sort of collapsing into a state of existentialist despair, really. You know, what's the point? What's the point of anything? What's the point of my life? What's the point of doing things the right way when, in this particular case in relation to Julian, the magistrate, who was very cruel and insensitive, decided that the accident was not the girl's fault, it was Julian's fault. Even though she rode into him from a country road, she T-boned him, as they say, because she was not able to see him when she was driving in.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That would have made it very easy for you at all.
It was very hard for everyone in the family, yeah. But these are important experiences, I think, if you're going to take a position like I have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I know what I'm like. I understand the darkness of the soul, really.
Wow.
I like that, you know, because that's like, it's from that point that you can rise.
Yeah, there was this definite rock bottom. In fact, I sort of ambled along for a bit longer, but I did actually end up in the psychiatric ward of a hospital. I'm going to say that and put that out there. I haven't really in very many of this style of conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Sure.
Yeah, but I want people to know that you can go that far down. It's not a sign of weakness.
Right.
It's a symbol of what you've been exposed to, and then you remake yourself. The transformation that occurs.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much
Thank you so much
for just being vulnerable with us today and with everyone listening. That's amazing. So from that point of despair, where did you get the courage to finish the book?
That's a really good question, because one of the things I lost as I was sort of falling down like Alice in Wonderland, down this black hole, one of the things I lost was the capacity to write.
Yeah. And
for a writer to not know how to put a sentence together is terrifying. Like, it's just the end, the very end. So I just had to put the manuscript aside for about probably 3 or 4 months. I still thought about it a lot, and I knew I was going to complete it, and I knew that for me the only rescue was for me to rescue myself. I understood that intuitively. I also, too, developed probably for the first time in my more recent adult life a kind of a very particular way of shaping a spiritualism. In our bedroom, there's a big window that faces out sort of northeast, and from that I can watch the sun in the morning. And I just remember thinking, look, I don't really know whether there's a God or not, but there's a connection between God and the sun. And if I can see that on sunny days, if I can see that sunrise, if I live for nothing else, if I have nothing else to live for but the simple rising of the sun, nothing other than that, because I couldn't feel my relationships with anybody. I couldn't feel my relationship with my husband or my children. Then I thought, that is a reason to be alive. That's enough of a reason to be alive. And having built that basis, that became the basis. From then I was gradually able to pick myself up. And then I started to do Sudoku, because Sudoku is not words, it's numbers. So there was no threat. I didn't have to complete a sentence. I didn't have to put 10 words together that made sense, let alone expressed something effectively. And since then, I've always done a lot of Sudoku as a form of meditation.
Love that.
Yeah,
that's powerful. So tell us now about the book and about your work in helping people understand death.
Okay, so I didn't have a publisher for a while, and then I was very fortunate in that a friend of mine who worked for Murdoch Books she's no longer a publisher with them, but she said, "Oh, what are you writing?" And I showed the manuscript to her, and she said, "Oh, we want to publish it," which was so lucky. So it was published in 2019, and I'd had a couple of sort of, I had a couple of sort of token publishing efforts before that. But then in 2019, when it was published, it was accompanied by a website, and the website just grew. And I thought when I first started writing the book, and this is before Julian died, this is before Mum died, I thought I'd be working on death for 6 months and then I'd go and work on something else like quilting or, flowers or, anything you like. But I've been at it ever since. And it's fascinating because from the website grew a newsletter, because my publisher said, well, look, if you've got a website, it makes sense to create a newsletter, because then you're able to capture and develop a relationship with the readers. You can reach out to them, you can send them something, you can develop a dialogue with people. And from there, that's just grown. I'm not going to say any of it's been easy. It's been very, very hard. And then from there, once the book was published, little speaking engagements, and then those speaking engagements have become bigger. And the other thing that's happened is that I have to make a living, and I've gradually given away the other writing that I was doing, which was freelance newspaper writing. And the work that I'm doing, I believe, is valuable, and lots of other people do. And I think it needs to be monetized, and there's two reasons for that. One is so that I can afford to keep doing it, but the other is so that I can have other people working with me. I can pay people to be working with me. So that's the model I'm moving towards rather. I've sort of shifted from being the employed journalist now to being somebody who's trying to be a businesswoman.
That sounds like it's actually become quite a quest for you, Margaret, the whole process.
Yeah, very much so. Because I believe that if we see in our culture, because we're a capitalist culture, you need to work in a market to give something value. I've come to that conclusion reluctantly because, I started life as a socialist. But I've realised as I've got older that you need to create a product that people value enough to want to be part of. And I come from a publishing background, so all my roads have been leading towards where I'm going now, which is to create a website which now has more than 400 articles on it, which are constantly refreshed, but now also creates an opportunity for various businesses connected to the death in industries, the fields, to talk to each other and to talk to consumers. And one of the problems that we've had in the past is that if you were facing these things for the first time, you would deal with your palliative care experience, and then you would deal with your burial experience with your loved one, and then you would deal with the cemetery experience, and then you would deal with your grieving experience, and all as completely separate, discrete, disconnected, terrible experiences. But what if we were to have a vehicle like mine where, as you need to find out about one aspect of this story, you actually find out about something else about it as well.
And that is so important. So important. And I know, and I'll get you to talk a little bit after about why death cafes are so important and why you're a part of that. But I know that's part of the death cafe, is connecting doulas, it's connecting palliative cares, nurses, and people that come have a holistic experience of what is death.
It's like a whole complete support.
Yeah, and having like a counsellor, because Charlene's a facilitator, as a counsellor, me as an ex-palliative care nurse, you as the good death expert. But I have I think the $1 million question right now.
Yes.
Is there such thing as a good death?
Now, that's a really good question. Professionals such as palliative care nurses, and I'll put you in this category, maybe, you might say no. They say, I used to be told, we shouldn't talk about a good death because there is no such thing as a defined good death. Now, my philosophy, and it's presented very carefully in the book, and it's been exposed, and I continue to point this out. A good death is your version of a good death. And what a good death is changes in time, and it changes geographically as well. It changes from culture to culture. It's a movable feast. It feels very fixed for each one of us, the idea of how death should be. I don't really believe in the shoulds in this. You do it the best way that you can with the best support that you can get. So for some people, it's going to be their idea of the best death, a good death, is to be able to die with their dogs that they love with them. For somebody else, it's going to be listening to a particular piece of music. For somebody else, it's going to be about being with the family that they love. And for many people, it will be about being with the people that they love. It's taboo, if you like, to talk about the good death in medical circles, but in social circles, when you're talking about consumers and you put your consumer hat on, we all have the right to have a good death. And how we define it, or the very best of the ways that our culture might define it. And there are many stories of very good deaths. And there are still, unfortunately, many, many stories of bad deaths. And a bad death can be one where the pain hasn't been managed properly, or it can be one where the pain has been managed, but not the suffering, because family haven't been present. A classic example of bad death, the recent COVID crisis, where people could get access to the best medical care, but they died without their family with them.
Yeah. And I have not a personal experience of someone dying alone, but a personal experience where we were in a red zone during one of our biggest lockdowns, and the hospital being 15 minutes away was not in a red zone. And I had my mother's sister who was dying of leukemia, and they called us in, and once they found out that where we lived, we weren't allowed to go upstairs. So that day I made sure that I got her discharged into my care so that she could die with her loved ones at home. And she ended up dying 2 days later, but it was at home with her loved ones. But we had to get letters so that we could cross borders from the hospital. Yeah,
it was a barbaric time, and I wrote about it quite a lot. I wanted to bear witness to the social story that was the COVID epidemic. We really, hopefully we developed some insights into the way that we manage this business of being human. And of course, the zones were considered necessary, but I would like to think that we will manage better. I think the idea that there's an arbitrary line, and that also too, the idea that came up a lot during COVID was, and it was evident when we first saw nursing homes being shut down, it was akin to watching the 12th century experience of the villagers being locked in a church and a fire being set. Because to lock people in with other people who were considered to be infectious did a disservice to both the infected person who we were told, and some people naively accepted, although not me, that the best hospital care was going to be delivered in the nursing homes. Not so. Not so.
It wasn't the case at all, no.
So I think the good thing is that there have been lots of learnings. When the next pandemic comes along, and there will be one in my lifetime, we will do things differently. We will do things better because of what we've learned. Yeah. But any bad deaths, and the idea of achieving the good death was set back. The cause was set back So that still, for example, there are arbitrary rules around the social aspects of medical care that crept in because of COVID, and then when COVID left, they stayed. There's examples of them all over the place. And we're human beings, we can do better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I like that. We can do better. Margaret, what advice would you give to someone who would like to discuss death with their family, or would like to open up that conversation of, their parents' wishes or someone they love's wishes or their own wishes, but really don't know how to broach the subject, because you said a good death is what you want it to be.
Yes.
Yeah, what advice would you give to that person?
It's been really interesting with the death cafes that you and I have been part of, Stephen, because we've seen a lot of people, we've met a lot of people who feel, and when I say they feel, they are right, their families won't listen to them and they want to talk about death. We still have a death-denying culture, so we don't like talking about it. It's considered rude in some circumstances. And there is a time and a place for everything, so I get that. But I think the best thing that you can do if you've got somebody elderly in your life who says that they want to talk about death, ask them what it is that they want to say and what it is that they want to share. We really have to learn how to listen to each other in this space and to hear different things and to be able to really do the deep reflection with the person. So, yeah, and I think older people in our culture have more of a problem communicating that they want to have this conversation than younger people do. An older person is able to talk to their GP, fortunately, in a city like Sydney now, and GPs, even in the last 10 years, have become better equipped at having conversations with them. When I'm running my workshops, I always get a piece of paper and divide it into 4, get people to divide their piece of paper into 4 and write 4 different things on it. So one of those is advanced care directive, the other is will, one is power of attorney, and the other is enduring guardian. Now, if you just write those things down and you're a person who doesn't know anything about death, then you can go onto the internet and you can find out a bit more about each one of those 4 subjects. They're overlapping, but they're quite different. You can also say to your family, this is something that I'd like to talk about. My advanced care directive is something that I would like to talk about. So there are challenges, yeah, for sure, in having the conversation. A lot of people say to mum or dad when they say they want to talk about it is, oh, no, you're all right. You're not going to die. You're a really healthy mum. Don't be morbid. We've got to learn how to say to our children when they say that to us, look, I'm not morbid or I'm not depressed. I just want to cover some practical issues. How about you sit down and have a cup of tea with me?
Yeah.
And we'll talk about this. There's a flip side, which is when you've got children who want to talk about it with an older parent who doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
That's got to be respected. If the older person flatly refuses to have the conversation that is about any of these things, that is their right. And some people, and my father was one of them, managed the idea of dying by never talking about it.
Yeah.
So there is an element of that. It's a matter of giving people the opportunity and finding out what of the many different things that they could be talking about that they want to. I've been doing a survey in my workshops and online, and I thought the biggest questions that would come up would be about voluntary assisted dying, but they're not. They haven't been at all. That's been a tiny question compared to the much bigger questions around 4 things, really. It splits into, in one of the quadrants, the big questions like, is there a God? And the little questions like, how do I access an advanced care directive through the internet? So that's little and big in one quadrant. Another one is managing pain, which is a legitimate and very, very reasonable fear to have. Will my pain be managed? There's a lot that's changed even in the last 10 years in attitudes towards pain management, but there are still nurses in nursing homes who have a very old-fashioned attitude which says, and this is one of the things that Mum ran into, which says that pain is ennobling. It makes you a better person. It might be that they believe that this is going to bring this person closer to God. There are a lot of Christians from different denominations who believe that. So there's quite a few different attitudes towards pain. So that's the second quadrant. The two that are most dominant sets of questions are, will my wishes be followed? Yeah. Now, we've got advanced care directive terminology coming into our systems. People do have to be taught that if you write a 34-page advanced care directive and you're rushed into emergency and decisions have got to be made about whether or not you'll be resuscitated, the accident and emergency personnel, doctor, is not going to sit down and go through a 34-page document. They're going to find the part that refers to your resuscitation plan. They're going to scan that and they're going to whack that into the record, and that will be the modus operandi by which they will work. So we have to give people very practical information about what an advanced care directive is and what it can deliver for them in a panicky situation. Now, if there's been a road accident, there's no advanced care directive discussed. But if you've had a heart attack and you've been brought in because you were down shopping in the mall and you come in lucid to the hospital and you're an elderly person, these are the issues that are going to have to be managed very quickly and under very high pressure. So these are the sorts of practical things that need to be talked about. And then that quadrant of questions that have come through the survey that we've been doing doesn't surprise me. None of the questions so far, or their sequencing, none of the ones that I've referred to have surprised me. What has surprised me is how clear and how anxious, how open people are about their anxiety about dying alone. And I think that partly is a reflection on the circumstances of a lot of elderly people in our culture who feel lonely. Yeah. A lot of the questions that have come through have talked about not just a fear of dying alone, but of being alone after they die, of not being found. Now, if you and I think about it, if the three of us think about it, we realise that there's no need to worry about your body after you're dead. You're not going to know anything about it. But this is a transference. What they're doing is they're very, very anxious about the fact, they think they're anxious about the fact that their body won't be found, but they're actually expressing something about the fact that they won't be found when they're dying, when they're still alive. So what do we as a culture do about that?
It's almost
There's a lot of work to do.
A lot of work. It's almost as though there's a loneliness pandemic more than anything.
Well, it's been well documented that loneliness is more threatening to your life than cigarette smoking, especially in an elderly person. Yeah. To be alone, or to be alone by choice is one thing, but to be lonely is quite another.
Yeah, true. But I think as I've heard, a lot of people, especially the elderly people, don't want to admit to the fact that they're lonely, because it's seen like almost as a, like, are you weak or something like that. Well, that's dependent.
That's a really interesting point. Look, I went recently to a local event about a nursing home that was being built in a suburb where there were lots of very big houses and they didn't want to facilitate old people. Now, the people who came along to the meeting because they didn't want an old people's home in their street were old people. They lived in very, very big houses. Yeah. They did not want their capital, their house prices, to be devalued by having a nursing home in their street. Now, for me, that was a graphic example of the conflicted way that we live in our culture. We accrue assets, and that gives us the empowerment to live alone. Sometimes people are living alone because they don't have very much in the way of resources, but loneliness is pervasive in old age. And there's a bit of death denial that goes on in this, because we say to ourselves, like the wealthy who won't have a bar of mixing with other people, and they are a quadrant of those who are in this alone situation that we're talking about, they're in a paradoxical situation where they have great fears about isolation, but their desire to control their circumstances means that they say, no, I'm not having a bar of anybody else. So what is it about our culture that's led us to a point where we've got those two very conflicted things happening in the mindset of most of us as we get older?
Yeah.
It's one of those questions that, I don't know, you can't really answer. Like, going back to the conversations around death, I know that we're both aware of what both of us want, absolutely. And we've got everything in place. And that's something we chose to do in our 40s because we don't know what life dishes out. But it was really interesting when I was talking to someone about it. They said, oh, but aren't you scared now that it's in place you're going to die? I'm like, it's not like I'm putting it out there.
When I get that question, I'm like, for me, as soon as we made those decisions, I feel like, okay, I had a big sigh of relief. Like, I can actually go ahead with the business of living now without having to worry about what's going to happen when I do die, like eventually. And I'm not focused on whether I die or whether I don't die. I'm just focused on living now. And I feel like
it's really interesting, because I think if you address, there is that sort of Buddhist, I'm not sure whether it's Buddhist actually, but there is a school of thought that has the little skull, the image of the skull on the desk to remind the person that they've got to think about death at least once a day. And by doing that, they will address it, acknowledge it, and not be quite so afraid of it.
Yeah,
it's great. Margaret, your website is a great resource for people that want to go and know about how to start conversations. Like, as you said, there's over 400 articles on that website. Where would you say would be the first place to go on your website if you're just starting to want to know more about becoming more death aware?
Okay, what I would suggest is you go into the menu and there are categories of stories. So you might be somebody, if you look at the drop-down menu, you might go into the category of stories that are about, I am experiencing grief, and they will help you with that. Or there's another set, I am caring for somebody who is dying. So they've got loose category names, but another way you could do it is just to go to the homepage, look at the articles, and at the top there's a menu for articles, and just click on the articles and just wander through them. There's also a really long index, a very full index. You could skim that and have a look at those. But at the bottom of each story, as well as having some resources and some commentary about people that you can contact, the way that the website works, it does lead you are led from that story to choices of about 3 other stories. You can start the wander pretty easily.
Awesome. And I've used your website many times as a resource and just as an for the Death Cafe, or even when I was supporting family members in death, because it's really interesting for me. I just go into nurse mode, and I usually start grieving a week after. Because I go into autopilot. It happened when I was looking after my father. It was really important for me that my father died at home because he had cancer and his mother was still alive. And I didn't want my grandmother at 93, who was with her, to see her son dying in the hospital. But I just went into nurse mode, even though it was my dad. And So your article helped me in that mode to support the others that didn't know the clinical side of it.
Yes.
And then, being able to just bring them along the journey as their family member was passing. And so I thank you for your website. It's a great resource as well.
Oh, thank you. That's really nice. Thank you very much for that, Stephen and Charlene.
Thank you, Margaret. So we're just going to get to the last two questions for tonight. And I know that you've, coming from a medical writer's background, you've had a lot of resources behind you to get through certain aspects of your grief. And be able to use those situations to rewrite your own story. But
Yeah.
what kind of advice would you give to someone who wants to rewrite their own life story, who may not be in that sort of situation, who may not have those kind of resources?
Look, I think the thing to do, if you're in a situation where the rewrite is coming, either it's because you want to do the rewrite, you can no longer contemplate doing those things you did before, or somehow or other it's presented itself to you, and it's this machine that you're being forced to sort of walk through, while it, like a big car wash machine, while it washes you and disrupts you, and you've got no choice. You just stand at the beginning and you just get led through on this process. I would say face the fear. Fear is what holds us back in these circumstances. And look, also kind of go where you're afraid to tread. No sort of girl from Strathfield who was born in 1959 like I was, lay awake in bed at night thinking, I can't wait to grow up and write about death. And when I felt myself drawn towards it, I thought, oh, this is no good. This is not good. People won't like it. It's an antisocial subject. But go where you're afraid to go.
Yeah.
And your fear lessens. And I think as you confront your fear, you develop courage just because you faced your fear.
Yeah.
So I've never felt more empowered than when I've sort of stepped into this area and thought, I'll just be brave and see how far I can push this. And the more brave, the more courage, the more brave, the more courage. So it's becomes a bit self-fulfilling.
I love that.
Yeah,
Thank you
that's
so much.
great, and thank you so much for that. It's really good insight. Margaret, if you could go back and rewrite your life story right now, what would it look like?
What would it look like? If I were to rewrite it, I had periods of my life, because journalism, I was a journalist, and journalism was a sort of it went through enormous change. It went through a period where the journalism that I was part of, which was the big newspaper experience, that actually died. It's not that anymore. There was a time when I really mourned the loss of that old life. I mourned the loss, I grieved the loss of the big journalism life.
Yeah.
And strangely, paradoxically, to your point, Charlene, before about if you face death, you actually embrace life. I wouldn't write a different story about myself now. And this is the first time I could say that. I'm not like I was when I was 30, wishing I was at a bigger, better newspaper. I'm absolutely content where I am, which I was not expecting. I did not expect at this stage of life to feel that way about it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Margaret, this has been an absolute pleasure having you on our show today. And I just really want to thank you for your vulnerability as well, because I know that vulnerability is going to help a lot of people in their grief. So thank you so much. And
Pleasure.
if you want to know more about Margaret and her work, all her links to her sites and her social medias are down below. And also there's a link to her website where you can get a copy of the book, The Good. Yeah. So thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen and Charlene. It's been a pleasure.
Now that we've interviewed our guest, join Charlene and I as we recap today's episode. Wow, that interview really took an unexpected turn. And again, I just want to thank Margaret for her vulnerability. She was so vulnerable in that interview and just really opened up. So I'm just so blessed that we had the opportunity to interview her, find out her story. But what were some of the major takeaways that you took out?
Yeah, I found it so encouraging about how she opened up, like, about her experiences with her mom, and like just how she was able to navigate through that, like just finding out, like, even though she was grieving herself, like during that whole process, even before she lost her mom, just how she was able to look out for and make sure that she was getting the support that she needed, just putting herself to one side and, really going through the motions, just getting there and making sure that her mother was looked after.
Yeah, and then to experience so much grief in such a short period of time with her brother's freak accident, it was, and then going through that whole court systems and then not going to your favor, like that's quite distressing. So, again, we just want to really thank Margaret. And, Margaret does a lot of great work around death, dying, and grief. So I would encourage you to visit her website if you know of anyone that's going through that. And also, there's a lot of things in the community around death cafes. As we said in that, Charlene and I are facilitators of death cafes, and it's just a place to normalize the discussions around death and dying. And how do you have those discussions with other people? How do you have those discussions with family members? Because everyone has the right to either die the way they choose to die, as in if they want to go, have their final days around loved ones, if they want to be in a palliative care setting, if they want to die at home. So everyone has a right to choose.
That's right.
And I know sometimes it's not practical for families, and that's fine.
Sometimes not everybody knows about that.
Yeah, and the support that's out there. Can I say one thing? I think in Australia, we are quite advanced from other countries when it comes to our palliative care initiatives. I think America does do a better job where they have these hostels with home environments. And, that's always been one of my things, that one day I want to open a hostel, which is not a hostel, but a hospice, which is more like a home environment where family can stay and all that. But Margaret's a whole wealth of resources. So please reach out. And, if this today's podcast has brought up some unresolved grief or has triggered some memories of loved ones or anything like that, don't be ashamed to ask for help. Don't be ashamed to reach out. Grief has no definitive. Grief has no stages. And you did a Facebook post recently around that grief is so personal, and we shouldn't push people through the 5 stages of grief.
Absolutely. Like, we all have, even though there are those 5 stages of grief, they're not supposed to be linear, and it doesn't matter where you are in that stage, like of grieving. I think we all go through it differently, right? We all have a different experience, and as unique individuals, we have a different story to tell and a different story to experience.
So reach out for help if you need help. You can also find our website some resources around grief and who to reach out to, but also in the show notes we'll make sure we put some links to different services as well.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. We hope you found it informative and inspiring. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and share it with your friends and family. Also, make sure to visit our website at www.rewriteyourlifestory.com.au to learn more about our mission, products and services. And remember, you have the power to rewrite your own life story. So go out there, face your challenges head on, and create the life you've always wanted. We'll see you in the next episode.